In exactly 3 minutes, the back windshield of a black SUV would explode inward. Nobody told Aurelia that. Nobody tells you those things. 11:47 p.m., Christmas Eve. Brooklyn. Her phone died in her hand like it gave up on her personally. 3%. 2. 1. Gone. She stood on that sidewalk, and the cold didn't just touch her. It pressed through her coat like it had something to prove. Around her, the whole city was alive. Couples. Laughter. Taxi lights smearing gold across wet pavement. Restaurant windows fogged up from the inside. All that warmth, none of it hers. She had learned a long time ago. Christmas wasn't a holiday. It was a reminder. Some people were chosen. Some people were not. Aurelia Vale had always been the second kind. She saw the black SUV roll to the curb, and something in her chest collapsed with relief. Finally. She didn't check the plates. She didn't look at the driver. She was cold. Her phone was dead. Her feet hurt. She opened the back door and slid inside. The locks clicked. Not one lock. All of them. At the same time. That sound, that small, quiet sound, is the kind of thing you only notice when it's too late. She exhaled, pulled her coat tighter. 4th Street, please. And can you turn up the heat? Silence. The kind that has weight. Then the driver turned around slowly. Ice blue eyes. Still. Not startled. Not confused. Not sorry. Assessing. Like she was something he had been waiting for. You're not my Uber, she whispered. No. The SUV jerked forward, and her stomach dropped straight through the seat. She grabbed the door handle, locked. Her pulse went from 0 to 100 in one heartbeat. Stop the car. See, stop. Stop the car. A second vehicle appeared from nowhere, sliding up alongside them like a shadow with an engine. A window rolled down. Metal caught the light. Then the world cracked open. The first gunshot hit the back windshield, and glass rained down across her shoulders like ice. A hand shot back from the front seat and grabbed her by the shoulder. Down. She dropped. More shots. Metal tearing. The sound of the city disappearing behind sirens and screaming. The driver didn't flinch, didn't panic, didn't pray. He spoke in rapid Italian into a headset with one hand and steered through impossible turns with the other, like this was a Tuesday. Her cheek was pressed against cold leather. Her hands were shaking, and somewhere in the chaos, one thought cut through everything else. Who is this man? And why does he drive like he expected this? The shooting stopped. Silence again. Worse than before. The SUV rolled on through the dark, and Aurelia Vale, the woman who just wanted heat and a ride home, began to understand. She hadn't chosen the wrong car. The car had chosen her. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from, and subscribe for more mind-blowing stories. She didn't move. Couldn't. Her cheek was still pressed against the cold leather seat, and her brain was doing that thing where it keeps replaying the sound of breaking glass on a loop. Crack. Rain. Crack. Rain. Slowly, very slowly, she pushed herself upright. The SUV was still moving. The driver was still calm. That was the part that scared her most. Not the gunshots, not the locked doors. Him. She studied the back of his head first. Dark hair, broad shoulders. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace. It comes from practice. From a life where chaos showed up so often, you stopped reacting to it. He ended the call in Italian without rushing. Set the headset down. Then he looked at her in the rearview mirror. Ice blue eyes. Same as before. Still assessing. Like she was a variable in an equation he was already solving. You're bleeding, he said. She touched her cheek. Small cut. Glass. You're kidnapping me, she said back. He said nothing, which was somehow worse than a denial. Who are you? Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She was proud of that. He didn't answer. Those men, they were shooting at you? At the car. That's the same thing. It's not. She stared at him. Pull over. No. I will scream. We're on the expressway. No one will hear you. She looked out the window. He was right. The city had already thinned out. Streetlights spaced further apart. Buildings giving way to dark. Panic tried to climb up her throat. She swallowed it. Think. 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 My name is Aurelia Vale. I am a paralegal. I have nothing. No money, no family. Nobody is going to pay you anything for me. So whatever you think I'm worth, I'm not. The rearview mirror again. He held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds longer than necessary. I know who you are, he said quietly. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. She felt the ripple move through her entire body. Then you know you have the wrong person. I have exactly the right person. The SUV slowed. Iron gates opened ahead of them. Tall, black, automatic, like they were expected. Beyond the gates, lights, garlands, a massive estate sitting in the middle of falling snow, like something from a Christmas card that forgot it was supposed to be warm. She looked at the gate closing behind them, then at the man in the front seat. He stepped out of the car, walked to her door, opened it, and stood there, patient, certain, like he had done this exact thing 1,000 times, and every time the person in the back seat eventually got out. She looked at him. He looked at her. Who are you? She asked one more time. The snow fell between them. Someone, he said. You were always going to meet. She got out. Not because she trusted him, because the gate was closed, the car was locked, her phone was dead, and somewhere behind them, men with guns were still in the city they just left. Sometimes your options make the decision for you. He didn't grab her, didn't rush her, just walked ahead at a steady pace through the snow, like he had somewhere to be and assumed she would follow. She hated that she did. The estate was wrong in a way she couldn't immediately name. It was enormous. That part made sense for a man like this. High walls, security cameras tucked into ivy like they were embarrassed to be seen. Guards near the gate who didn't look at her because they had already been told not to. But then, Christmas. Everywhere. Garlands thick with pine and gold ribbon wrapped every pillar. Candles burned in every window. A wreath on the front door so full it looked like it took someone an entire afternoon. She had expected cold stone and shadows. She got Christmas. Her brain didn't know what to do with that. The front door opened before they reached it. A woman appeared in the doorway. Older. Round face. Red wool shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. The kind of woman who looked like she had been warm her entire life and wanted the same for everyone she met. She looked at the man first. Then she looked at Aurelia. Her eyes went wide. And then soft. Oh, she breathed. You brought someone. The man removed his coat without looking up. Don't start. I'm not starting anything. She was already moving toward Aurelia with both hands outstretched. You're frozen. Come inside. Come. Come. Aurelia didn't move. I was kidnapped. The woman blinked, then waved her hand like Aurelia had said something mildly inconvenient. Nonsense. You're here now. That's what matters. She took Aurelia's hands in both of hers. They were warm, impossibly warm. You need soup. Inside, the house smelled like rosemary, and bread, and something sweet she couldn't place. Laughter drifted from somewhere deeper in the house, distant and easy, like people who had nowhere else they wanted to be. She stood in the hallway and felt the warmth of the house settle against her frozen skin, and something in her cracked, just slightly, just enough. The man walked past her toward the staircase. My mother, he said flatly, without turning around. Ignore her. His mother smiled at Aurelia like that was the funniest thing she'd heard all week. Then she leaned in close and whispered, He brought you here on Christmas Eve. She squeezed Aurelia's hands once. He has never brought anyone here. Not once. Not ever. She pulled back, still smiling. So whatever you think is happening. She glanced toward the staircase where he had disappeared. It's bigger than that. His mother's name was Sarah. She said it like a song. Sarah. Short. Warm. The kind of name that sounds like it was made for kitchens and laughter and pulling people in from the cold. She also didn't stop moving for a single second. Within 4 minutes of walking through that door, Aurelia had a bowl of soup in her hands, a dry pair of socks on her feet, and a wool blanket around her shoulders that smelled like cedar and something floral she couldn't name. She hadn't asked for any of it. Sarah hadn't asked if she wanted it. Some people give help like a question. Sarah gave it like a fact. "Eat," Sarah said, settling across from her at the kitchen table. "You look like you haven't eaten since yesterday. I was shot at 40 minutes ago, which means your body burned through everything it had." She pushed the bowl closer. "Eat." Aurelia ate. She hated how good it was. She hated how safe the kitchen felt. The low light, the warm walls, the distant sound of a television somewhere in the house. A normal sound. A home sound. She had been in this man's house for less than an hour, and it already felt more like Christmas than anywhere she'd spent the last 10 years. That scared her more than the guns. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps. Unhurried. The kind that knew every inch of the floor they walked on. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. Changed clothes. Dark sweater. No coat. No headset. He looked, and this was the part she couldn't reconcile. Normal. He looked at the bowl in her hands, then at his mother. Sarah smiled innocently and said nothing. He pulled out the chair across from Aurelia and sat down. Not close, not far. Exactly the right distance for a man who wanted to be readable, but not readable enough. "How's the ankle?" She blinked. "What?" "You were favoring your left side when you walked in." She hadn't noticed that herself. "It's fine. Sarah will bring ice." "I don't need—" Sarah was already at the freezer. She watched him at the table. He wasn't performing calm. He was calm. The way a man is calm when he has been through worse things than tonight, so many times that tonight barely registered. That should have been a red flag. Instead, she found herself wondering what a person has to survive to get that quiet. Sarah set ice wrapped in a cloth on the table, kissed her son on the top of his head without a word. He didn't pull away, just sat there. Let her. And Aurelia Vale, who had grown up without anyone, in houses that never felt like homes, eating Christmas dinner, alone at a table set for one, felt something move in her chest. Quiet. Unexpected. Dangerous. She didn't sleep. Not really. She lay in the guest room, which was larger than her entire apartment, which she tried not to think about, and stared at the ceiling while the night pressed against the windows. The bed was too soft. The room was too quiet. Her mind was too loud. She replayed it in order, the way she always did when things went wrong. Start at the beginning. Find the moment you should have known. The dead phone, the curb, the black SUV, the locks. You're not leaving. That voice, low and certain, not raised, not cruel, just final, like a door closing on a room you didn't know you were already inside. She pressed her palms flat against the mattress. Who is he? A soft knock at the door. Not him. The knock was too gentle for him. Come in. Sarah opened the door just wide enough to slip through. She was carrying 2 cups of something hot and wearing the expression of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this conversation. She sat on the edge of the bed without being invited. Aurelia had already learned that Sarah didn't wait for invitations. She handed over one of the cups. Chamomile. Still too hot to drink. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sarah said, "He won't tell you his name himself. He never does." Aurelia looked at her. "Everyone who works for him calls him Mr. Santoro." She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "The city calls him other things. Worse things. Things that are true and things that aren't." She paused. "But his name," she smiled softly, "is Kyle." Kyle. It landed differently than she expected a name to land. Not soft, not hard. Something in between, like a word that had been carrying weight for a long time and had learned to hold it without showing the strain. "Santoro," Aurelia said quietly. Sarah looked at her. "Is that name supposed to mean something to me?" The older woman's expression shifted, just slightly. A flicker of something, not surprise exactly. More like recognition, like a puzzle piece finding its edge. "Not yet," Sarah said carefully. She stood, set her cup down on the nightstand, moved toward the door, then stopped. "You're safe here," she said without turning around. "I know it doesn't feel that way, but you are." Aurelia said nothing. Sarah glanced back over her shoulder. "He has never brought anyone to this house." Her voice was quieter now, almost to herself. In 40 years of my life, I have watched that boy choose alone over and over again. She opened the door. Until tonight. The door clicked shut. The room was silent again. Aurelia sat with the warm cup between her palms and one word turning over and over in her mind. Kyle. She didn't feel safe. She felt something far more unsettling than that. She felt seen. And she had no idea yet just how long he had been watching. She woke up with a plan. That was the thing about Aurelia. Even in chaos, even in fear, even in a bed that belonged to a man whose last name now sat in her chest, like a splinter she couldn't reach. Her brain kept moving. It was the only thing she had ever fully trusted. She took her time, ate breakfast at the kitchen table like a woman with nowhere to be, smiled at Sarah when Sarah refilled her tea, asked for a second piece of bread like someone settling in. She was not settling in. She was counting. Guards, rotations, blind spots. The gap between the east garden wall and the camera mounted on the corner pillar. 14 seconds. Maybe 16. She had been a foster kid in 7 different homes before she turned 16. She knew how to read a building. She knew where they always forgot to watch. 10:23 a.m. She slipped out through the side door near the laundry room. Cold air hit her like a warning. She didn't stop. Head down. Steady pace. Not running. Running draws eyes. She walked like a woman who belonged in the garden, moving toward the east wall with her hands tucked in her borrowed coat. 12 seconds. 10. She reached the wall, found the foothold she had clocked from the window last night, a gap between 2 stones, low and wide enough. She grabbed the top of the wall, pulled. The ice got her. Not a person, not a guard, not Kale. Ice. A frozen patch on the upper stone she hadn't seen from the ground. Her grip slipped, her body twisted, and the ground came up fast and hard and completely without mercy. The pain in her ankle was immediate and total. She lay there in the snow for a full 3 seconds, just breathing. Of course. A shadow fell over her. She didn't have to look up to know. She looked up anyway. Kale stood at the edge of the path with his hands in his coat pockets, not rushing, not angry, watching her with the flat expression of a man who had set a clock and was simply waiting for it to go off. "Finished?" he said. She said nothing. "The camera on that corner resets every 30 seconds, not 16. He tilted his head slightly. "You were close." She stared at him. "Were you watching me the whole time?" "Yes." "And you let me try anyway?" "You needed to." He reached down without asking and lifted her clean off the frozen ground like she weighed nothing that mattered. Carried her back toward the house. She wanted to fight it. She had no fight left. "You don't listen," he said quietly. "Let me go." "No." Not heated. Not cold. Just the same immovable certainty as that first night. The locks clicking. "You're not leaving." She hated how consistent he was. She hated even more what that consistency was starting to feel like. He set her down on the sofa in the study. Not roughly. Not gently, either. Carefully. The way you set down something you've decided matters. She noticed that. She noticed everything about him now, and she wished she could stop. He disappeared for 2 minutes and came back with a bandage roll, a cloth, and a small bowl of warm water. He pulled the footstool close, sat down in front of her, and without asking, without a single word, he took her injured ankle in both hands and began to unwrap it. She watched the top of his head. His hands were steady, warm, moving with the kind of precision that didn't come from medical training. It came from a life where someone always needed tending, and there was nobody else to do it. She thought about Sarah, raising a boy like this alone, in a world like his. "You could have stopped me before I hit the wall," she said. "Yes, but you didn't." "No." She waited for more. He kept working. "Why?" He didn't look up. "Because you needed to find out for yourself that there's nowhere to go right now." He pressed the cloth gently against the bruise already forming. "If I'd stopped you in the garden, you'd have spent the next 3 days looking for the next gap." She hated that he was right. She hated it quietly, privately, where he couldn't see it. "You said I'm not a prisoner." "You're not. People who aren't prisoners can leave. When it's safe. Yes. And when is that? He finally looked up. This close, his eyes weren't just ice blue. There were layers in them. Something old sitting underneath the calm. Something that had been through fire and come out not destroyed, just permanently changed. Soon, he said. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. He wrapped the ankle, tied it off, checked it once. Then he stayed there, sitting in front of her on the footstool, with his forearms resting on his knees. Not moving, like he had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. You're my responsibility, he said finally. The word landed strange. Responsibility. Not prisoner. Not guest. Not problem. Responsibility. I didn't ask to be anyone's responsibility, she said. I know. Then what gives you the right? Nothing. His voice was flat and honest. I have no right. Only obligation. She stared at him. Obligation to who? He held her gaze, and for just 1 second, one unguarded, uncontrolled second, something moved behind his eyes that he didn't manage to hide in time. Something that looked less like duty, and more like something he had been carrying alone for a very long time. He stood up, rested the ankle, and walked out before she could ask the question that was already forming. Obligation to who, Kyle? Who sent you to find me? She was going crazy doing nothing. That was the thing nobody tells you about being held somewhere against your will. It's not the fear that breaks you first. It's the stillness. By midday, she had read every title on the study bookshelf twice, counted the ceiling beams, watched snow fall until snow falling lost all meaning. Her ankle kept her off it. Her mind would not stay off anything. She needed to work. It was the only thing that had ever made the noise stop, the specific quiet that came from finding the flaw in something everyone else had missed. The wrong clause, the buried liability, the number that didn't match the one 3 pages back. She had been doing it since she was 12 years old, sitting in a foster home doing other people's tax paperwork for something to focus on. Nobody had ever called it a gift. They called it useful. There was a difference. The contracts were stacked on the corner of his desk. She told herself she was just looking. She picked up the top one. Italian letterhead. Property acquisition. 12 pages. She turned to page 4 out of habit. That was always where they hid the problem. There. Clause 7. Subsection C. A liability transfer written so cleanly, it almost looked legal. Almost. You're staring at that contract like it insulted you. She didn't startle. She had heard him come in, those unhurried footsteps, and decided not to look up. It did, she said. Silence. Then, and this was the part she didn't expect. He crossed the room, stood beside the desk, looked at the page she was holding. Explain. Not put that down. Not, that's not yours. Not who gave you permission. Explain. She looked up at him. His face was neutral, but his eyes were doing that thing, that focused, layered thing, that meant he was actually listening. She pointed to Clause 7. Whoever signed this transferred the liability without transferring the asset, which means if this deal collapses, and it will collapse, the market index it's tied to has been declining for 6 weeks. You absorb the loss. Not them. Beat. You've been set up, legally, quietly, and very expensively. He took the contract from her hand, read the clause himself. The room was completely silent. She watched his jaw tighten, barely, just once, and then release. He set the contract down, pulled out the chair across from her. Saturday. Slid the entire stack toward her. Find the others. She looked at the stack, then at him. Please, he added. It sounded like a word he didn't use often, and like a muscle he had almost forgotten how to flex. She pulled the stack toward her, and for the first time since Christmas Eve, nobody was running. Nobody was shooting. Nobody was locking doors. 2 people sat across a desk in the quiet, and one of them finally felt like herself again. 2 days passed. Nobody shot at anyone. It was somehow the most tense 48 hours of her life. It started small. Day 1. Morning. She asked for her own copy of the property files. He said no. She took them anyway while he was on a call. He found her at the kitchen table with them spread open and said nothing. Just refilled his coffee. Sat down across from her, opened his laptop, like they were colleagues, like this was normal. It was not normal. Afternoon, same day. She found an error in a shell company registration, the kind of error that could unravel 3 years of legitimate business in one court session if the wrong person found it first. She circled it in red pen, slid it across the table without a word. He looked at it for a long time, then looked at her. How did you know where to look? I always know where to look. Why? She held his gaze. Because I grew up invisible. Invisible people learn to read rooms that weren't built for them. Something shifted in his face. He picked up his phone and made a call. Fixed it that afternoon. Never said thank you. But that evening, Sarah brought her a cup of chamomile she hadn't asked for and said, "He told me what you found." That was his thank you. She filed that away somewhere she didn't examine too closely. Day 2. He watched her think. She had noticed it the first day but dismissed it. Now she couldn't dismiss it. When she read, he looked up from his own work and watched her face. Not her face, exactly. Her process. The moment her eyes slowed down on a page. The small crease between her brows when something didn't add up. The way she tapped the pen twice when she found what she was looking for. He studied her, the way she studied contracts, looking for the clause that explained everything. She watched him too. Twice. Twice. She saw him reach for his phone with the specific energy of a man about to make a call he would regret. Jaw set. Eyes flat. The city's worst instincts sitting right there on his face. Both times he put the phone down, stood up, walked to the window, stood there until whatever it was past, then came back, sat down, said nothing. She said nothing either. But she felt it. The weight of what he was choosing not to do. The cost of it. That night she lay in the too-soft bed and stared at the ceiling again, and admitted something she had been refusing to admit since Christmas Eve. He wasn't what she thought he was, and she didn't know yet what that meant. But the not knowing had a feeling to it now. Warm, quiet, dangerous, like standing at the edge of something with no railing and not wanting to step back. She found it by accident. That was the thing about the truth. It never waited for you to be ready. It didn't knock. It didn't warn you. It just appeared on a shelf in a library at 11 p.m. while you were looking for something to read. The library was at the end of the East Corridor. She had passed it 3 times without going in. Tonight her ankle felt better. Tonight the house was quiet. Tonight something pulled her toward it, the way you get pulled toward a room you can't explain. Dark wood, floor-to-ceiling shelves, the smell of old paper, and something leather-bound and serious. She ran her fingers along the spines, not reading titles, just feeling. Then her hand stopped. A frame on the shelf between 2 thick books, small, dark wood, like someone had placed it there deliberately but not prominently, like something kept close but not displayed. She picked it up, a newspaper clipping, yellowed, behind glass, 20 years old. The headline was in bold. Vale versus Santoro. Case dismissed. City accounts frozen. She read it once, twice. The words moved but didn't change. Vale. Her surname. Her father's surname. The only thing he left her before he died when she was 6 years old, and the state closed his file and handed her to the first of 7 homes. Santoro. The name she had learned 5 days ago in a bedroom that smelled like cedar and chamomile from the lips of a woman who gave warmth like a fact. Both names. Same headline. Same case. 20 years ago. Her chest went tight. She read the article fast, then slow, then fast again. Her father had been a lawyer. She knew that. One photograph. Dark coat. Serious face. A file under his arm. That was all she had ever had of him. But this said he had stood in a federal courtroom and argued against a man named Santoro. This Santoro. Kyle's father. Won. The room tilted slightly. She steadied herself against the shelf. Sealed records. That's what they always told her. Your father's records are sealed. Nothing to access. Nothing to see. She had stopped asking at 14. She had believed it at 16. She had buried it at 22. And here it was. On a shelf. In his house. She didn't hear him come in. She only knew he was there because the air in the room changed. That specific shift that happened whenever Kyle entered a space, like the room adjusted itself around him. She turned. He stood in the doorway. He looked at the frame in her hands. And for the first time, in every moment she had watched him stay controlled and unreadable and perfectly still. His face broke. Just slightly. Just enough. He looked afraid. "You knew," she whispered. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence said everything the headline hadn't. Neither of them moved. The library held them in its silence, like it had been waiting 20 years for exactly this moment. Snow pressed against the windows. The frame was still in her hands. "How long?" she asked. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Not weak. The kind of quiet that happens when something inside you is working very hard to stay standing. "How long have you known who I am?" He stepped into the room. Didn't rush. Didn't retreat. Moved to the chair beside the fireplace and sat down like a man preparing to finally put something heavy on the floor. "Since the night you got in the car." She felt the air leave her lungs, not dramatically, not in a gasp, just out. Slow and total. "You knew my name." "Yes." "Before I told you." "Yes." She set the frame down carefully on the shelf. And carefully, because if she held it any longer, she didn't trust her hands. "Then the locks were not to keep you in." He looked at her directly. "They were to keep them out. The men following that car had been watching the pickup point for 3 hours. Watching for me? Watching for whoever I collected." She turned to face him fully. "You were expecting someone." "Yes." "Me specifically." A pause. "Yes." She crossed the room slowly and sat in the chair across from him. Not because she was calm, because her legs needed the help. "Tell me everything," she said. "All of it. Right now." He told her. Not quickly. Not performing. Just directly. The way a man speaks when he has rehearsed something for years and is finally tired of rehearsing it. Her father's name was Tian Vale. Lawyer. 34 years old when he walked into that courtroom. Nobody had expected him to win. The Santoro name had weight in that city the way weather has weight. You didn't argue with it. You moved around it. Tian Vale didn't move around it. He argued. And he won. "My father lost everything public that day," Kyle said. "The accounts, the contracts, the legal face of everything he had built. And my father?" Something moved through Kyle's eyes. "Died 3 months later." The fire cracked. She stared at him. "How?" "Car accident. Officially. And unofficially." He held her gaze. Didn't flinch. Didn't look away. "My father ordered it." The words dropped into the room like something thrown from a great height. She heard them. Felt them hit. Sat very still. "Your father," she said slowly, "killed mine." "Yes." "And you knew that? When you locked those doors, when you carried me inside, when you wrapped my ankle and sat across that desk, yes, you knew the entire time." "Yes." She stood up. Not in anger. Not yet. In something older than anger. Something that had been living in her chest since she was 6 years old, in a room that wasn't hers, wearing clothes that didn't fit. Being told her father's records were sealed, it rose up now, clear. Cold. Total. "Then why?" she said. "Why lock the doors? Why bring me here? Why any of it?" He looked up at her from the chair, and what she saw on his face stopped her completely. Not guilt, not strategy. Grief. Raw. Old. Heavy. "Because," he said quietly, "you are my last chance to become better than him." She didn't sit back down. Not yet. She stood in the middle of that library with 20 years of sealed truth sitting open around her, like a room with all its walls pulled off, and she made herself breathe. "Better than him," she repeated. "Yes. That's why you brought me here. That's why you were always going to end up here." She looked at him sharply. "What does that mean?" He stood up, moved to the desk in the corner of the library, opened the bottom drawer, pulled out an envelope, old, cream-colored, edges soft with age, and held it out to her. She didn't take it immediately. She looked at it first. Her name was on the front. Not her full name. Just the Veil Girl. Written in handwriting that wasn't Coyle's. She took it. Opened it. One page. Handwritten. Italian at the top, English below. A date, 11 years ago. On a signature at the bottom she didn't recognize. But the name printed above the signature, Domenico Santoro, Kyle's father. Written 11 years ago, 3 years before he died. She read it twice, then looked up. He wrote this himself? 2 weeks before he was killed. Kyle's voice was steady, but it cost him something. She could hear the cost. He didn't tell me. His lawyer found it in a private deposit box and delivered it to me on my 30th birthday. What does it say? She asked. Even though she had just read it, she needed to hear him say it. He looked at the fire. That your father was the only man who ever defeated him and showed him mercy in the same breath. She hadn't expected that word. Mercy. Your father won that case, Kyle continued. He had everything. Criminal charges, frozen accounts. Prison was the next step. He paused. But he stopped. Why? Because a full trial would have destroyed every legitimate business connected to the Santoro name. Hundreds of jobs, families, people who had nothing to do with what my father did. He looked at her. Your father chose to wound instead of destroy. And your father had him killed anyway. Yes. The word landed like a stone. And spent the rest of his life knowing that the man he killed was better than him. She read the letter again. The last paragraph. If my son becomes what I nearly did, find the Veil Girl. She is proof that strength without mercy is just violence. Let her remind him of what her father taught me too late. She lowered the page. Christmas Eve, she said slowly. The car, the pickup point. His lawyer set it in motion. The pact had an expiration, this Christmas Eve. If nothing triggered it, it died with him. But something triggered it. Someone inside this house told the rivals the pact existed. His jaw tightened. They arranged the gunman, knowing you'd be caught in the middle. She felt the full weight of it settle. I didn't choose that car. No, she looked at him. The car was always mine. She slept with the letter under her pillow. She didn't decide to do it. Her hand just put it there before she closed her eyes, and she didn't argue with herself about it. It was the only thing she had that her father had touched, even if he'd never known it was for her. Morning came gray and heavy. She found Kyle at the kitchen table before Sarah was even awake. Coffee. Laptop. 3 phones lined up like soldiers. Dark circles under his eyes that told her he hadn't slept at all. He looked up when she walked in, looked back down. Sit, he said. Not a command this time. Something closer to, please don't make me say this standing up. She sat. He turned the laptop to face her. A map. The city. Red markers clustered in 4 locations. The Breva family, he said. The Fulci. The Oren group. And one faction inside my own organization whose name I don't have yet. She studied the map. They're surrounding the estate. They've been surrounding it since Christmas night. He pulled the laptop back. They're not here for territory. They're not here for money. He looked at her. They're here because I haven't retaliated. She let that sit for a moment. Restraint looks like weakness. In this world, yes. Every hour I don't respond to Christmas Eve is an hour that reads as fear. His voice was flat, factual, like he was reading from a document about someone else's life. They're waiting for me to break, pick up the phone, send men out, start the war they've been trying to start for 3 years. And if you do, then I become my father. He closed the laptop. Completely, permanently. And if you don't, they move on the estate within 72 hours. The kitchen felt smaller suddenly. She looked at the map burned into her memory. 4 clusters. 1 traitor inside the walls. A man across the table choosing not to reach for the weapon that would save him fastest. They're not just threatening you, she said slowly. No. Her eyes met his. They know about me. He was quiet for exactly 1 second too long. Kyle. Yes. The word came out low. They know your name. They know why you're here. They know what you represent. I'm not just leverage against your instincts. No. I'm leverage against the Pact itself. She felt it click into place, cold and precise. If I'm gone, your father's last instruction dies with me. There's nothing pulling you toward change. Nothing proving mercy exists in this world. You're the only living proof, he said quietly, that a Vale and a Santoro can exist without destroying each other. She sat with that, the weight of being someone's proof, someone's last argument against the worst version of themselves. She had spent her whole life being useful to people who never saw her. This was different. This man saw her completely, and it terrified her how much she didn't want to disappear. She found him in the courtyard at noon, standing in the snow with his back to her, coat on, hands at his sides, looking at the gate like a man having a conversation with a version of himself he was trying to leave behind. She watched him from the doorway for a moment. The snow was falling again, quiet and indifferent the way snow always is, like the world keeps being beautiful whether you deserve it or not. She stepped outside. "You're going to let me go," she said. He turned. "Yes." "When?" "Tonight. My men will escort you to—" "That's not what I mean." She crossed the courtyard until she was close enough to see his face clearly. "You're going to let me go, and then you're going to pick up those phones and make those calls and burn everything down, because that's the only move left that keeps you alive." He said nothing. "I'm right. You're usually right. Don't do that." "What?" "Agree with me like it's simple." Her voice stayed level, but something underneath it wasn't. "You're telling me the only way to protect me is to send me away. And the only way to protect yourself is to become the thing your father's letter begged you not to become." He looked at her steadily. "Yes." "So your plan," she said, "is to lose both. My plan is to keep you alive. At the cost of everything the Pact was built for. The Pact was built on paper. Your life is not paper." She stared at him. He stared back. Neither of them moved. "You kept me here to control yourself," she said. "Yes." "You used me as a reason not to retaliate." "No." Something sharpened in his voice, just slightly, just enough. "I used every hour you were in this house to remember what your father proved, that there is another way. That strength doesn't have to end in blood. And now, I'm out of hours." The wind moved between them. She crossed her arms against the cold and thought about her father. 34 years old, standing in a courtroom against a name the whole city feared, choosing to wound instead of destroy, showing mercy to a man who would not show it back, dying for it. She thought about a 6-year-old girl in a house that wasn't hers being told her father's records were sealed. She thought about 7 homes, 20 years. One envelope with the Vale girl written on the front in a dead man's handwriting. "You're not out of hours," she said. He looked at her. "I'm still here." She held his gaze. "I didn't come this far. I didn't get in that car and survive that night, and read that letter, and sit across that desk and find every flaw in every contract, to watch you throw away the only thing your father got right." A long silence, snow between them. "What are you saying?" he asked. She didn't look away. "I'm saying don't send me away." Her voice was quiet, certain. "I'm saying let me finish what my father started." He tried to argue. She didn't let him. Not because she was louder. She wasn't. Not because she was harder. She wasn't that either. She just kept meeting every exit he offered with the same steady eyes and the same immovable answer. "Number." "I'm staying." By the time Sarah appeared in the doorway with 2 coats and an expression that said she had been listening from the hall and wasn't even slightly sorry, he stopped arguing. That night she sat in the study while he met with his men. She wasn't invited. She went anyway. He looked at her when she walked in, looked at his men, looked back at her, said nothing. Moved 1 seat over. She sat down. The meeting was in Italian mostly. She caught fragments, names, locations, the specific tightness in the room that lives in spaces where men are deciding how much violence to authorize. 3 times she watched Kyle reach the edge, the moment where the decision could tip, where one word from him would send men out those gates and start something that couldn't be undone. 3 times he pulled back. The 3rd time his eyes found hers across the table. She didn't nod, didn't gesture, just held it. Stay. He looked away, pulled back. The meeting ended without a single order given. 2 a.m. She woke to the sound of vehicles. Not one. Multiple. Engines low and deliberate. The sound of people who have decided. She was at the window before she was fully awake. Headlights beyond the gate. 4 vehicles. Men stepping out into the snow like shadows with intention. Her stomach dropped. 72 hours, he had said. It had been 41. She ran. Down the corridor. Down the stairs. Through the hall where Sarah stood frozen with both hands pressed to her mouth. Out the front door. The courtyard. Kyle was already there. Alone. Standing between the closed gate and the house with his coat open and snow on his shoulders, like he had been there long enough for it to settle. His men were behind him, 6 of them, armed, waiting. Across the gate, the rivals had stopped, watching, measuring. Their leader stood at the front, waiting for Kyle to make the move that started everything. She watched Kyle's hand, saw it move to his side, saw him draw, raise the gun. The courtyard went completely still, the specific stillness that exists only in the half-second before everything changes forever. She couldn't breathe. Nobody breathed. He lowered it. Slowly. Completely. His arm dropped to his side, gun pointed at the ground. He stood in the snow with his shoulders back and his head up and his weapon at his feet, and said 2 words. Stand down. His men didn't move immediately. 1 second. 2. Then, they lowered their weapons. She stood in the doorway and felt something move through her that she had no word for yet. Watching a man born into violence choose, in the coldest, most dangerous moment of his life, not to be his father. For no audience, no guarantee, no safety net. Just choice. Pure and costly and completely his own. The rivals didn't leave. That was the problem with lowering a gun in a world that only spoke that language. Silence didn't mean peace. It meant the other side was recalculating. She watched the leader through the gate. Dark coat, patient face. The kind of man who had been doing this long enough to know that when someone didn't shoot, it wasn't always mercy. Sometimes it was weakness. He was deciding which one this was. Kyle stood in the snow and didn't move. His men stood behind him and didn't move. The rivals stood beyond the gate and didn't move. A standoff with no floor. The kind that only ends when someone falls through. She stepped forward. Not to the gate. Into the courtyard. Far enough that she was visible. Far enough that the leader's eyes moved from Kyle to her. She felt them land. Stayed still. Kyle turned his head slightly. "Sorry, go inside." His voice was low. Controlled. The kind of voice that is not making a request. "No. Aurelia. I heard everything in that library," she said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the man beyond the gate. Every threat, every account, every name. A beat. "Including yours," she said to the leader. The courtyard shifted. She had found it 2 days ago, buried in the 3rd folder of the shell company registrations, a name she hadn't recognized then, a signature on a notarized document that tied a dead man's offshore accounts to a living one. She had written it down in the margin, circled it, because it didn't fit. She hadn't known yet why it didn't fit. Now she did. She looked at the leader directly. "Those offshore accounts your entire operation runs through. They're notarized by a man named Fen Castor." She kept her voice even, conversational almost, the way she spoke in every legal room she had ever been invisible in. Fen Castor died 14 months ago. Stillness. A dead notary means every document he certified in his last 6 months is legally contestable. She let that land. Which means your accounts are contestable, your contracts, your territory claims, all of it. She reached into the pocket of her borrowed coat, pulled out folded papers, held them up. "I have the original filings, dates, signatures, certified copies of his death record." She looked at the leader. 1 call, 1 lawyer, 1 morning in court, and everything you've spent 15 years building collapses legally, publicly, and permanently. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The snow fell into the silence, and the silence held. The leader looked at Kyle, then back at her. His jaw worked once, then he turned, got back in his vehicle. The others followed. One by one, the headlights reversed into the dark, until the road beyond the gate was empty. Kyle turned to look at her. He didn't speak immediately, just looked at her, the way you look at something that just rearranged your understanding of what's possible. "You saved this family," he said. She lowered the papers, met his eyes. "No." Her voice was quiet and completely certain. "I saved this city. The courtyard emptied. The gate closed. The snow kept falling like it hadn't just witnessed something that should have been impossible." Nobody spoke for a long moment. His men stood behind him in a line, and she could feel the weight of their silence. Not confusion exactly. Something more uncomfortable than that. 6 men who had spent their entire lives in a world where problems ended with weapons, standing in the snow, watching a woman with folded papers do what guns had been failing to do for 3 years. One of them, older, thick scar along his jaw, looked at Kyle, then at her, then back at Kyle, and gave one slow nod, the kind that doesn't need words because the words would only make it smaller. Kyle turned to his men. "Go inside." They went. No questions, no hesitation. While whatever she had just done, it had shifted something in the air around him. Something in the way his men moved near him. Like the ground under his authority had just been confirmed rather than shaken. Restraint had looked like weakness to the outside world, until it won. They stood alone in the courtyard, snow between them again, always snow between them. She looked down at the papers in her hand, smoothed the fold once with her thumb, the way she always did when a case closed. A small private gesture nobody had ever noticed before. He noticed. "How long had you known about Castor?" he asked. 2 days. "You said nothing." "I didn't know what it connected to yet." She looked up. "I do now." He studied her face. "You walked out here alone, against armed men, with paper. Paper built this city," she said simply. "Paper can take it apart." He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet she had learned to read by now. Not empty. Full. The kind that meant he was somewhere inside himself adjusting to a new weight. "My father ruled through fear," he said finally. "I know. Everything I inherited was built on it. Every relationship, every agreement, every border. I know that too." He looked at her. "You just ended a 3-year standoff without a single casualty." "Yes. By knowing more than they expected. By being exactly what they forgot to account for." She held his gaze. "Invisible people learn to carry what powerful people overlook. I've been doing it my whole life." A beat. "Tonight I just finally did it for something that mattered." He crossed the courtyard, stopped in front of her, close, not threatening, not performing, just present, fully. In a way she had only seen him be with his mother, and never with anyone else. He looked at her like she had shifted gravity, like the world was the same size it had always been, but the thing at the center of it had quietly changed. "My father destroyed yours," he said quietly. "Yes. And his daughter just saved everything he left behind." She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. The snow answered for her, falling soft and even on both of them. No difference, no distance, just 2 people standing in the same cold, finally on the same side. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been since she arrived. Not the tight, held breath quiet of men waiting for violence. The other kind. The kind that comes after something breaks, and the breaking turns out to be the beginning of something rather than the end. Sarah had tea on the table before either of them reached the kitchen. She looked at Aurelia's face, then Kyle's face, then the empty courtyard through the window. She didn't ask what happened. She just pressed both palms flat on the table and closed her eyes for 3 full seconds, like a woman delivering a private prayer she had been saving for a long time. Then she poured the tea, and quietly left the room. They sat across from each other. Same table as the contracts, same chairs, same distance, everything the same. Nothing the same. She wrapped both hands around the cup. The warmth moved through her fingers, and she realized they had been shaking, not from cold, from everything, and only now was the shaking slowing down. He watched her hands, didn't comment, just reached across the table and moved the sugar closer to her without being asked. She almost smiled. Almost. There's still a traitor inside this house, she said. I know who it is. She looked up. Since when? Since this morning. He held her gaze. I needed tonight to play out first. Why? Because I needed to know what I would choose when the moment came. Something moved through his eyes. Before I dealt with anything else, I needed to know what I was. She understood that, more than she expected to. Later, the fire was low, and the snow outside had softened to something gentle, and the house had settled into the particular stillness of very late night. She was standing at the window in the sitting room when she heard him come in. She didn't turn around. You should sleep, he said. Soon. Silence. Then footsteps. Close. She turned. He was standing in front of her, and his face had none of its usual architecture. None of the controlled stillness. None of the careful distance. Just raw. Open. Something she had no word for, looking directly at her without apology or performance. My father believed in you, he said quietly, before I knew you existed. She waited. And he stopped, started again. I have spent every year since his letter trying to be worth the belief. He looked at her. I don't know if I am. And then, Cale Santoro, the man the city feared, the man who drove through gunfire without flinching, the man who stood in a courtyard and chose restraint when every instinct screamed otherwise, sank to one knee, in the firelight, in the snow quiet, in front of her. No dominance, no command, no transaction. Just a man kneeling before the weight of everything he owed and everything he wanted, and the one person in the world who carried both. Stay, he said, barely above a whisper. Not because the Pact says so. Not because you're proof of anything. Not because I need you to save this family, or this city, or whatever is left of my name. He looked up at her. Stay because I am, for the first time in my life, and asking. The fire cracked softly. She looked down at him. This man, this impossible, violent, careful, untrying man, kneeling in the ruins of everything his family built, choosing differently, for no guarantee, for no safety net, just her. She reached out, touched his face once, gentle, the way you touch something you've decided to keep. Get up, she said softly. He stood. She didn't step back. Ask me again, she said, standing up. And he did. He asked her standing up. Same words, same voice, different weight. Because the first time a man asks from his knees, it's surrender. The second time he asks on his feet, it's choice. And there is a canyon of difference between those two things that most people never learn to cross. She had learned it the hard way. So had he. She didn't answer immediately, not because she didn't know, because she wanted to feel the full size of the moment before it became memory, before it joined everything else that had happened in 7 days and got folded into the story she would carry for the rest of her life. She wanted to stand inside it, just for a second. The fire had burned down to embers, orange-red. Quiet. The kind of light that makes everything look like it was always supposed to end up here. She thought about the sidewalk, 11:47 p.m. Christmas Eve, cold, pressing through her coat, phone dead in her hand, the whole city alive around her with warmth that didn't belong to her. Watching a black SUV roll to the curb, not checking the plates, not checking the driver, just getting in. A week ago, she said softly, I got in the wrong car. Something moved across his face, slow, warm, the rarest thing she had ever seen on him. A smile, not performed, not controlled, real, small and real, and completely his. You got in the only car, he said. That could change me. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had known her name before she said it, who had locked the doors to keep death out rather than keep her in, who had knelt in firelight without strategy or performance, who had stood in a courtyard in the snow and chosen legacy over survival, who had a mother who gave warmth like a fact, who said please like a muscle he was learning to use again, who studied her the way she studied contracts, looking for the clause that explained everything. She thought about her father. 34 years old in a courtroom, choosing to wound instead of destroy, showing mercy to a man who wouldn't show it back, dying for it. She thought about a dead man's letter with the veil girl on the front. She thought about what it meant that the car had chosen her, that the Pact had chosen her, that all of it, every sealed record, every closed door, every Christmas spent alone, had been pointing here, to this room, this fire, this man. I grew up with nothing, she said quietly. 7 homes, sealed records, a photograph of a father I never got to know. He listened. He always listened. I spent 20 years being useful to people who never saw me. She looked at him. You saw me the moment I got in that car. Yes. Before I said a word. Yes. Why? He held her gaze with everything he had. Because I had been looking for you, he said simply. Longer than I knew. She exhaled, slow and complete, like something she had been holding since she was 6 years old. Finally. Finally. Let go. Then yes, she said. One word, the size of 20 years. He didn't move dramatically, didn't pull her close, didn't perform the moment for an audience that wasn't there. He just stilled. The way a man stills when something he stopped believing in walks back through the door. And breathed. New Year's Eve came quietly. No gunfire. No headlights beyond the gate. No men with weapons deciding the value of other people's lives. Just snow. And the particular stillness of a house that had stopped holding its breath. Sarah cooked for 6 hours. Nobody asked her to. Nobody could have stopped her. She moved through the kitchen like a woman paying a debt of gratitude to the universe, pulling things from shelves, humming something old and Italian, stopping occasionally to press her hand flat against her chest like she needed to check that her heart was still in there and still full. At one point, she caught Aurelia watching her from the doorway. She pointed a wooden spoon. Sit down. You're helping. Aurelia sat down. She helped. And somewhere between chopping herbs and learning the name of every spice Sarah refused to measure, she understood what a kitchen was supposed to feel like. Evening came. The city lit up through the tall windows. Distant fireworks already starting early the way cities do when they have survived another year and need to tell someone. She stood at the window in the sitting room, different from a week ago. Same woman. Different gravity. He appeared beside her. No announcement. No footsteps she could track. Just there. The way he was always just there now. She didn't turn. Neither did he. They stood side by side looking out at a city that didn't know what had happened inside these walls over the last 7 days. Didn't know that a woman got in a car that chose her. I didn't know that a man stood in a courtyard and broke a cycle that had been running since before either of them were born. Didn't know that a dead lawyer's mercy had outlived him by 20 years and finally arrived where it was always going. The fireworks came properly at midnight. Gold and white and red breaking open over the dark city like the sky was trying to say something it didn't have words for. Sarah appeared in the doorway behind them, looked at the two of them standing at the window, pressed both hands to her mouth, went back to the kitchen. You locked the doors, Aurelia said softly. Yes. On Christmas Eve. On a woman you'd never met. Yes. A woman who got in the wrong car. The only car. She turned to look at him. He turned to look at her. Fireworks broke gold across his face, across hers. Say it again, she said. And he looked at her the way a man looks when he has finally stopped being afraid of what he feels. You're not leaving. A week ago, those words were a locked door, a warning, a wall. Tonight, they were something else entirely. Tonight, they were the truest thing in the room. Tonight, they were home. She turned back to the window, leaned her shoulder against his. He didn't move away. The city burned gold and bright and loud below them. And Aurelia Vale, who grew up with nothing, who had 7 homes and 0 Christmases, and a father she knew only from a photograph and a dead man's letter, smiled. Quietly. Privately. The way you smile when you finally stop looking for something, because you just realized you're already inside it. Before you leave, I need to ask you something. Aurelia didn't choose that car. So she was cold. Her phone was dead. She just wanted to go home. But that one moment, that one unlocked door, that one split-second decision, changed everything. So here's my question for you. Do you believe some people are meant to find each other, no matter what it takes to get them there? Or was this just a woman who got lucky in the worst possible way? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if your answer gives me chills, I'm pinning it. If this story held you from the first second to the last word, hit that like button right now. You don't even have to think about it. You already know. Subscribe, because the next story is already written, and I promise you, it will find you at the exact moment you need it. Comment your favorite chapter below, just the number. I'll know why. And share this with someone tonight. Someone who needs to be reminded that the worst door that ever closed on them might have been the one protecting them.